My aunt told the family I was a leech. She said I'd spent 2 years cozying up to a lonely old woman because I smelled money. She said it in mediation. She said it in front of a judge. She even said it at Christmas the year before, when she thought I wasn't listening. What she never said, not once, not ever, was where $340,000 went. My grandmother's name was Elaine. She was 79 years old, 5 feet 2 inches tall, and she made the best lemon pound cake I have ever eaten in my life. She also had a mind like a steel trap right up until the very end. She remembered birthdays without cards. She remembered what you ordered at a restaurant 3 years ago. She remembered every promise anyone ever made to her, and she would remind you of it with a smile that made you feel both loved and slightly terrified. I started visiting her regularly when I was 24, not because anyone asked me to, not because I was angling for anything. My parents had moved to Phoenix. My brother was stationed overseas. I was living 40 minutes from Grandma Elaine in a 1-bedroom apartment, working as a customer service rep for a logistics company, making $38,000 a year, and eating a lot of rice and frozen vegetables. I visited her because she was funny, because she taught me to play gin rummy, and she cheated, openly, without shame, and found it hilarious every time she got caught, because she had lived a long and complicated life, and she talked about it like she was narrating a movie she had already seen the ending of and wasn't worried about anymore. I visited her because I liked her. I know how that sounds now. I know what Aunt Carol turned it into, but for 2 years it was just Tuesday afternoons, and gin rummy, and lemon pound cake, and a woman who called me her girl and meant it. Aunt Carol is my grandmother's oldest daughter. She is 61 years old. She lives in a 4-bedroom house in Scottsdale. Her husband is a semi-retired contractor, and she has, for as long as I can remember, operated under the unspoken assumption that she is the family's most important person. She organized the holidays. She sent the group texts. She decided when family dinners happened, and who sat where, and what we were allowed to discuss. She was not cruel about it. That's the thing about people like Carol. They don't need to be cruel. They just quietly arrange things until the arrangement suits them and everyone else has already agreed, without realizing they were being asked. My grandmother loved Carol. Carol was her firstborn. That matters to some mothers in a way that never fully goes away, no matter how old everyone gets. But Grandma Elaine also saw Carol clearly. She told me once during a gin rummy game that I was actually winning for once, that Carol had good intentions and a strong need to be right about them. I laughed. Grandma didn't. She just looked at her cards and said, "When I go, you're going to be taken care of." I made sure of it. "Don't let them tell you otherwise." I told her not to talk like that. She told me to stop being sentimental and play my hand. I didn't think about that conversation again. For almost 2 years, my grandmother died on a Tuesday in March. Congestive heart failure. She had been declining for about 4 months. It wasn't a surprise, but it was still the kind of thing that knocks the floor out from under you, even when you knew it was coming. The funeral was small, immediate family only. Grandma had requested that specifically. She didn't want a production. She wanted people to eat good food and tell stories about her, and then go home and get on with their lives. We did our best. Aunt Carol handled the arrangements because Aunt Carol always handles arrangements, and also because, as it turned out, she was the named executor of the estate. My grandmother had 3 children, Carol, my father David, and my uncle Pete. My father and Pete were both named in the will as beneficiaries, along with me and my 2 cousins on Carol's side. 4 beneficiaries total, split equally. That was what Grandma had told my father years ago. He hadn't thought to ask for anything in writing because she was his mother, and he trusted her. We all trusted her. We just didn't think about who was going to be in charge of carrying out what she wanted. 17 days after my grandmother died, Aunt Carol sent an email. Subject line, "Mom's estate. Update for the family." I still have it. I have read it so many times. I could recite it from memory. It was 4 sentences long. The first sentence said she had been working with an attorney to settle the estate. The second sentence said the estate was more modest than expected due to outstanding debts and end-of-life expenses. The third sentence said she anticipated each beneficiary would receive a small distribution likely under $5,000. Once everything was finalized, the fourth sentence said, if we had questions, we could call her. That was it. No itemized accounting, no list of debts, no attorney's name, no timeline. 4 sentences. My father called her that afternoon. She told him end-of-life care was expensive and that she was doing her best and that it was a hard time for everyone and she'd appreciate it if the family could be supportive rather than difficult. My father apologized for bothering her. My Uncle Pete texted me the next day and said, guess there wasn't much left. That's how it goes. And I sat with that for 3 days. I sat with the email. I sat with the 4 sentences. I sat with the word modest, and I kept coming back to a Tuesday afternoon in my grandmother's kitchen, a gin rummy hand I was finally winning, and a woman who said, don't let them tell you otherwise. I want to be honest about where I was at this point. I had nothing. No documents, no financial statements, no photographs of anything, no emails from my grandmother about money, no records of any kind. What I had was a memory of a conversation that Aunt Carol's attorney would later describe, in mediation, as the recalled impressions of a grieving young woman who admittedly has no corroborating evidence. He wasn't wrong about the evidence part, but I also had 17 days. 17 days between my grandmother's death and that email. I looked up how long probate typically takes in this state. The answer is months, sometimes over a year for complex estates. I looked up what an executor is legally required to provide beneficiaries. The answer is a formal inventory of estate assets, an accounting of all transactions, and notice before any distributions or liquidations. I had received none of those things. What I had received was 4 sentences and a suggestion to be supportive. I called a probate attorney. Her name was Sandra. She charged $275 an hour. I did not have a lot of money at the time. I put the consultation on a credit card. Sandra listened to everything I told her. The email, the timeline, the conversation with my grandmother, my complete lack of documentation. Then she said, the lack of documentation doesn't matter yet. What matters is that you are a named beneficiary, and you have not received a formal inventory. That's not optional. That's the law. We file a petition to compel an accounting. Then we see what the accounting says. I asked her what she thought my chances were. She said, I think something happened. I don't know what yet. Let's find out. I signed the retainer. The petition landed on Aunt Carol's attorney's desk on a Thursday. By Friday afternoon, Carol had called my father, my Uncle Pete, and both of her own daughters. I know this because my father called me that evening, and he did not sound happy. He said Carol was very upset. He said she felt I was attacking the family. He said Pete thought I was making something out of nothing. He said Carol's daughters, my cousins Meg and Dana, who I had grown up with, who had been in my grandmother's kitchen almost as often as I had both called me, in Carol's words, ungrateful. Then my father said, very quietly, she also said, and I'm just telling you what she said, that she always felt you spent so much time with Mom, because you were expecting something, that you were never really there for Mom. You were there for what Mom had. I didn't say anything for a long moment. Then I said, Dad, do you believe that? He was quiet. Then he said, no, but I also don't want a war. I told him I understood. I told him I loved him. I told him to stay out of it if he needed to. Then I hung up, and I sat in my apartment for about an hour, doing nothing, because here is what Aunt Carol understood that I hadn't fully accounted for. The Leech accusation wasn't just an insult, it was a strategy. If I was a calculating, money-hungry opportunist who had befriended a vulnerable elderly woman purely to position myself for inheritance, then everything I said looked suspicious. My memory of that conversation? Convenient. My petition? Exactly what you'd expect from someone like that. My grief? Probably performance. She had taken the truest thing about my relationship with my grandmother, and she had flipped it into evidence against me, and I had nothing to fight it with except the truth, which, as anyone who has ever been in a legal dispute knows, is sometimes the least useful thing you have. The formal accounting came in 6 weeks later. Sandra called me the morning she received it. She said, okay, I need you to sit down. I was already sitting down. I told her so. She said the accounting listed the estate assets at time of death as follows. 1 checking account, $4,200. Personal property, furniture, jewelry, household items, estimated $3,800. Outstanding medical debts, $6,100. Funeral and burial expenses, $4,400. Net distributable estate, approximately $1,900, split 4 ways, $475 each. I asked Sandra what was missing. She said, well, according to public records, your grandmother held a brokerage account with Vantage Financial Group as recently as 14 months ago. It doesn't appear in this accounting. I felt something go very still inside me. I said, how much was in it? Sandra said, the last $10,099 on record for her Social Security number shows dividend income consistent with a portfolio of approximately $310,000 to $360,000. I said, $340,000. Sandra paused. Then she said, you've heard that number before. I said, she told me once in her kitchen. I thought she was just talking. Sandra said, she wasn't just talking. What happened next took 4 months. I want to be honest about those 4 months, because the storytime version of this would have me striding into courtrooms and delivering speeches and watching Aunt Carol crumble in real time. The reality was slower and uglier and more exhausting. Sandra filed a motion challenging the accounting. Carol's attorney filed a response. Sandra filed a motion to compel production of financial records. Carol's attorney filed objections. There were hearings, there was paperwork, there were phone calls from my father asking if I was sure about this. There were calls from my cousin Meg, who told me I was tearing the family apart over money, which I always knew was the only reason I visited Grandma anyway. That one hurt. I am not going to pretend it didn't. Meg had been to my grandmother's house maybe 6 times in the last 2 years. I had been there every Tuesday. I had taken Grandma to her cardiologist appointments. I had sat with her during the hard weeks when she couldn't sleep and didn't want to be alone. And here was Meg, from a distance of 600 miles, telling me I never cared. I cried about that exactly once. Then I filed it away and kept going because I had made a decision in that first phone call with Sandra. I was not doing this for the money. I mean, I was not going to turn down my rightful inheritance if it existed. I was 26 and broke, and $340,000 split 4 ways was real money to me. But I was doing this because my grandmother sat across from me at her kitchen table and told me she had made sure, and someone had tried to unmake it, and then that same someone had called me a leech for noticing. The court ordered a subpoena for Vantage Financial Group's records related to my grandmother's account. Those records arrived on a Wednesday. Sandra called me that afternoon, and she was very calm, the way people get calm when something is so large that getting excited about it would feel inappropriate. She said the brokerage account had contained $338,400. At the time of my grandmother's death, she said the account had been liquidated in 2 transactions, one for $190,000 and one for $148,400. Both occurring within 19 days of her death, both initiated by Carol Whitmore, acting under a power of attorney that had been granted 18 months earlier for the purpose of helping manage routine bill payments, both transferred to a personal savings account held jointly by Carol Whitmore and her husband, Robert Whitmore, at First Central Bank. Sandra said, I want to be careful about the word I use here. Legally, we call this a breach of fiduciary duty, unauthorized liquidation of estate assets, potentially elder financial abuse, depending on when the liquidation decision was made relative to your grandmother's capacity. I said, what do normal people call it? She said, they call it stealing. The mediation was scheduled for a Tuesday. Of course it was a Tuesday. I wore a gray blazer I had borrowed from a friend. I drove 40 minutes to a law office downtown. I sat on one side of a long table. Aunt Carol sat on the other side. She looked the same as she always looked, put together, composed, the kind of composed that takes practice. Her attorney was a man named Gerald, who had the energy of someone who had spent 30 years making problems go away quietly and was annoyed that this one wasn't cooperating. He opened by saying this was a family matter that had unfortunately escalated unnecessarily. He said Carol had acted in good faith in her role as executor. He said end-of-life expenses, including the management of certain liquid assets that had had been partially allocated prior to death, under the power of attorney, were complex matters that required nuance to understand. Then he said, and I will never forget this, he said, we would also like to note for the record that our client has serious concerns about the motivations behind this petition. It is our position that the petitioner developed a pattern of behavior over the course of 2+ years designed to cultivate favor with an elderly, emotionally vulnerable woman with the goal of influencing her estate decisions. We believe the petitioner's claims stem not from genuine concern, but from an expectation of reward for a relationship that was, at its core, transactional. He said that while looking at me, Carol did not look at me. She looked at the table, and I thought, she can't look at me. She has known me since I was born. She came to my high school graduation. She has sat at the same holiday tables as me for 26 years. She knows every word he just said is a lie, and she still let him say it. I looked at Sandra. Sandra gave me a very small nod. Then Sandra opened her folder, and she placed the Vantage financial records on the table. She placed the bank transfer records next to them. She placed the timeline, date of death, date of first transfer, date of second transfer, date of the email to the family, in a single clean document, across from Gerald. Then she said, we'd like to discuss where $338,400 went between March 14th and March 31st. Gerald looked at the documents. For the first time since we sat down, he stopped looking composed. Carol's attorney asked for a recess. They took 40 minutes. When they came back, Gerald's opening offer was that Carol would repay $200,000 and the family would sign a mutual release. Sandra said no. Gerald said $240,000 and an acknowledgement from Carol that she had made errors in judgment. Sandra said no. Gerald said $280,000 and a full release and a confidentiality agreement. Sandra said, my client is not signing a confidentiality agreement, and the number is $338,400 plus interest plus legal fees, or we go back to the judge and we also make a referral to the DA's office for elder financial abuse. Your client had power of attorney for bill management. She used it to liquidate a $338,000 investment account 19 days after her mother died. We can have that conversation in a courtroom, if you prefer. Gerald looked at Carol. Carol looked at Gerald. Then Carol looked at me, for the first time all morning. And I want to tell you, she looked remorseful. I want to tell you I saw something real cross her face. What I actually saw was calculation. She was figuring out which version of this cost her less. She chose the settlement. The agreement required Carol to repay $338,400 in full within 90 days, transferred directly into the estate account to be distributed to the 4 beneficiaries. Per the original will, she was removed as executor. A neutral third-party administrator was appointed. Her legal fees were her own problem. There was no confidentiality agreement. The referral to the DA's office went in anyway, not because Sandra thought it would necessarily result in charges. These things rarely do, but because there was a paper trail that deserved to exist somewhere official. My share of the estate came to $87,200. After the legal fees, Sandra earned every dollar of I paid off my credit card. I paid off my car. I put the rest in an index fund. And I thought about my grandmother sitting at her kitchen table, telling me she had made sure she had. She just hadn't accounted for Carol. Then again, maybe she had. Maybe that's why she said it out loud to a granddaughter she knew would remember. Who would sit with a gut feeling long enough to act on it? Who wouldn't sign the release? My father called me the week the settlement was signed. He said, I should have believed you faster. I told him it was okay. He said, it's not. You were right. And I let her talk me into doubting you, and I'm sorry. I told him I knew. I told him I forgave him. I meant both things. My Uncle Pete sent a text that said, good job, kid. That was Pete's version of a standing ovation. I took it. My cousins Meg and Dana said nothing. I don't think they will, not because they're bad people, but because they watched their mother do what she did, and then watched it unravel in real time. And there is no version of that you can easily talk about at Thanksgiving. We haven't had a family Thanksgiving since. I don't know if we will. That's one of the things nobody tells you about being right. My grandmother told me once that the thing about family is that people confuse loyalty with silence. She said, "Loyalty means you tell the truth, even when it costs you. Silence just means you're protecting yourself and calling it love." She wasn't talking about Carol when she said it. She was talking about something else entirely. Some old family story I only half knew, but she said it the way she said most things, like she was leaving it somewhere for someone to find later. I found it. I didn't visit my grandmother for 2 years because I wanted something from her. I visited her because she was worth visiting, because she cheated at gin rummy and made lemon pound cake and told the truth about things that most people in our family had spent decades carefully not saying. Aunt Carol called me a leech in a mediation room, in front of a table full of lawyers. She said I never cared. She said it was always about the money. What she couldn't explain, not then, not ever, is why a woman who was only after an inheritance would have kept showing up on Tuesdays for 2 years when there was no reason to believe there was any money at all. You don't grieve a transaction. I grieved my grandmother for a long time. I still do. The $87,000 is in an index fund. The gin rummy cheat is irreplaceable.